Hey everybody, today this video is going to give us an opportunity to review some microeconomics. A lot of the classes I teach are applied microeconomics classes, and not everybody takes their electives right after their core classes. And so there might be some concepts that you're fuzzy on or you don't recall, or that you just want a little review of and a fact check on. So I'm going to put some videos together to do that and help accommodate you and hopefully get you ready for whatever micro elective you're taking, or just get a refresher of microeconomics to help you on your way. So first of all, you want to remember that microeconomics is the study of individual decision makers, firms and households usually. And so we're looking at those decisions. And that's why a lot of people sometimes like micro better than macro. Macro is this zoomed out view, looking at whole countries, looking at fiscal and monetary policy, whereas micro is things like taxation and how much of a good to produce, how much to consume, budget constraints, really the kind of stuff that we're already doing. And it's a lot more familiar because it's what a lot of us are already doing. So what we're going to start with today is just a review of market in perfect competition. And so you want to remember that we talk about perfect competition in economics as a starting point because it's the ideal, it's the easiest to understand, generally accepted, and it's sort of our baseline, and then other forms of competition or deviations from that. That said, is perfect competition common? No, not really, but we see elements of it everywhere. I've got my handy dandy whiteboard, so I'm going to remind everybody that when we talk about a market in equilibrium and in perfect competition, we want to have a functioning dry erase marker. Sorry, it's the week after winter break, so a lot of my pens are dead. There we go. So when we're talking about markets, we're going to be in price and quantity space. And so we're going to be looking at the price of goods and then the quantities demanded and supplied. And I'm going to go ahead and use P and Q generally. You want to make sure you're always labeling your graphs in whatever you do, because otherwise you're going to have distorted meanings or angry professors. When we're thinking about the market for a good, no matter what the good is, we're going to expect some kind of generally downward sloping demand curve because of the law of demand. Remember, the law of demand says that as prices go down, we demand more of things. So think about going into a luxury store versus going into the dollar store. You buy more low-cost items than you do high-cost items. Obviously, there are other factors in play, but if you hold everything else constant, you're going to buy more 5-cent candy bars than you will $50 candy bars if they're the identical same candy bar. So let's say we're going to look at the market for, I'm going to say books. And so I've got my downward sloping demand curve, because the cheaper they are, the more I'll buy. And this is a true life story for me because I have bought a lot of discount books that I have never read. We also have to have the supply curve. So remember, the demand curve represents an individual's willingness to pay. And so what we see is up here we have people who are willing to pay a lot for a given book. Down here, people with a low willingness or ability to pay. And that's how we get our market equilibriums and our positive outcomes, our welfare and all that. It's because the people with the highest willingness to pay value the book the most and enter the market first. On the other hand, with firms supplying goods, in this case books, to the market, we're going to see an upward sloping supply curve because firms are willing and able to supply more as the price increases. And we're going to see the firms that can produce books at the lowest cost enter the market first, and those that are less efficient and produce at a higher cost enter the market last. And that's part of where the efficiency of markets comes from. That's why economists love markets so much, because now with our upward sloping supply curve, we can see really efficient firms right here that produce books at a really low cost enter the market first. Individuals who really want books and have a high willingness to pay enter the market first. And then people who don't want to buy books or are bad at making them don't enter the market because we have our equilibrium here in the middle where supply meets demand. So remember, supply and demand are the curves, and then along the curves we have the quantity demanded at any given price and the quantity supplied at any given price. And equilibrium, or Q star, occurs where we have a price such that quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And so there's a lot of ways to think of equilibrium, but one really great way to think of equilibrium is when no one can be made better off by going anywhere else. And so we can demonstrate that pretty easily by just picking any other point on the graph. So if I want to say, I want more people to get books, so I want to have this be the new equilibrium quantity. Well, at this pink Q here, the price that consumers are willing to pay is lower than the equilibrium, and the firms who produce books at that level, it costs them a lot more. And so the price that sellers are willing to sell books at is much higher than the price that consumers are willing to buy books at. And that creates a disequilibrium, right? No one's happy by that. If I'm only willing to spend $5 on a book, and they need me to spend 15 to make it worthwhile, that exchange will not happen. And so when we're in a period of disequilibrium, we expect to move back to equilibrium because there's no incentive to be anywhere else. So hopefully that kind of makes sense and refreshes your memory about the market forces of supply and demand and how equilibria make everyone better off. Another way to think of it is to sit there and kind of just, like I said, look at that equilibrium price and quantity and then see what happens if you raise or lower the price or increase or decrease the quantity. Is anybody made better off? Would anybody make that choice? So like if we raise the price, that makes producers happier. We can draw that on, right? Firms want to make more money. So let's raise the price to $15, $20. Suppliers are going to be willing to supply a lot more books, maybe 150 books to the market now, but consumers at that higher price of $20 only want to buy, say, 50 books. So we're not made better off. Same thing if we lower the price. If we were to lower the price to try and make consumers happy, we're going to have the same problem. If prices are too high, we're going to have a surplus, firms supplying more to the market than consumers want. If prices are too low, let's say we put it down here at $5, well, yeah, sure, now consumers are super happy. We're going to demand way more books. Maybe we want to demand 100 books, but firms, that's a really low price. They can't afford to stay in business. Maybe half of the book suppliers go out of business, and the ones that remain are only willing to supply, 50 books to the market. So we'll have a shortage. And no one likes a shortage, right? Remember trying to get a PS5 last Christmas or present day? Shortages cause inefficiencies. And so we're much better off when we're in equilibrium and when the people with the highest willingnesses to pay get the good from the firms with the lowest costs. And that's generally why economists love markets. When markets work well, that's what happens, and everyone's made better off. So far, so good, right? Okay, so that's supply and demand. From supply and demand, we can take a lot of other intuitions in this model. We can talk about welfare. You want to remember that in a market like this, there is a lot of different welfare to go around. We can think about the consumers, all these consumers with this high willingness to pay who only pay the market price. So let's go ahead and put real numbers in there for our equilibrium. Let's say these are affordable books. These are $12 books, and we're selling 100 of them in the market in equilibrium. So quantity demanded at $12 is 100, quantity supplied at $12 is 100, and everyone's happy with that. Everyone's really happy with that because all of these people on this side of the demand curve up here would have paid more than $12. This demand curve represents the willingness to pay of the marginal consumer. So here somebody would pay $50 Here somebody would pay $50 or $20. Here somebody would pay $12. And then down here somebody would only pay like $2 for the book. Everybody who buys a book, the first 100 consumers who get that book, all have a greater than or equal to willingness to pay to $12. They would have paid $12 or more. But because we have a market economy, they only pay $12. So this pink triangle represents the consumer surplus, the benefit to consumers of being in the marketplace, getting a better price than you would have paid. And so that's kind of something we can sometimes identify with, right? Going to the store and thinking, oh, I really need avocados. I want to make guacamole. I'd pay $2 for avocados, and then they're $1. That's consumer surplus. You gain $1.50 or $2, whatever the difference is. If you would have paid $2 and you only have to pay $1, you get $1 of consumer surplus, of utility, of benefit from being in the market and not having to pay your maximum, but rather just pay the market price. Same thing happens for firms. Firms also get surplus, and that comes from the fact that the supply curve is given by firms' willingness to sell, their cost. So explicitly, if you remember firm costs, the supply curve ends up being the marginal cost curve for these firms. And so what we're looking at with the supply curve is the cost of producing each additional unit, each additional book. And so when they get $12 for a book that only cost $4 to make, they get a profit, a producer surplus. And so we can measure the area above the supply curve and below the price line as the producer surplus, the benefit to producers of being in the marketplace. And that's cool because now we can mathematically measure the benefit to consumers and producers of being in the marketplace of a market economy of perfect competition. And they both benefit. How much they benefit depends on the slope of the supply and demand curve. It's sometimes equal, it's sometimes not. We could have curved supply and demand curves, and that makes it a more complicated mathematical problem. But the point is generally that beneath the demand curve and above the price is consumer surplus. Beneath the price and above the supply curve is producer surplus. And for both of them, it's the benefit of participating in the market, and altogether it gives us consumer welfare. Right? If we alter the outcomes, we can change the consumer welfare. We can impose a tax and generate a deadweight loss and some revenue, and that's going to change our welfare and give us different outcomes depending on the nature of the market we're in. So what would that look like? If we imposed a tax on books, let me get a couple more colors in here. What we could do is say, we're going to tax books, and I'm going to do an example that's pretty symmetrical and simple because there's no need to make the math complicated. We're just working on the concepts here. So let's say we're going to tax books $2 per book. Cool, $2 each. So that means that we're going to, it doesn't matter when we impose a tax. One of the big ideas of taxation is that it doesn't matter whom you impose the tax on. The burden of the tax is a function of the price elasticities of demand and supply. Remember, elasticities are just responsivenesses to change in price. So how much does that tax affect consumers and affect producers? If consumers really, really need books and can't live without them, the tax won't affect them very much because they have to buy the books. If suppliers have to sell the books, they really need to get them out of the marketplace, then the tax won't affect them much either. And so the low responsiveness, the low price elasticity is going to mean that they'll pay the tax no matter what. In this case, we're going to assume an equal price elasticity for both consumers and producers. So I'm going to go ahead and say that now the price that producers get is $11, and the price that consumers pay is going to be $13. So that's our $2 tax. So we go from $12 books for consumers and producers to consumers paying $13 and producers only getting 11 of them, and 2 of the dollars go to tax revenue. So this rectangle now becomes tax revenue. And that is good. Tax revenue is good. Tax revenue counts towards total welfare because it goes to the government, gets paid for social services. You could think of it as just basically being redistribution, right? It's going to come back out some other way. What isn't good is this triangle here. So what this triangle here represents is the fact that at $12, 100 books were bought and sold, and now with the tax, only 90 books are being bought and sold. So that means we've got reduced economic activity. Fewer books are being sold than there would have been without the tax, and fewer books are being purchased than there would have been without the tax. So all of the consumers and producers on this part of the demand and supply curve are forced out of the market because the tax alters the prices, makes it less feasible to be in the market. So that's where that deadweight loss comes from. And we can calculate the value of it, right? 10 books, and we have a base, we have a triangle here with a height of 10 books and a base of $2. So it's telling us that basically we lost out on $10 of economic activity. Does that kind of make sense? Area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. Height is 10, base is 2. 2 times 10 divided by 2 is 10. Kind of make sense? So in this case, we still have some consumer surplus, but it's smaller. We still have some producer surplus, but it's smaller, and it's shrunk by the size of the revenue and by the size of the deadweight loss. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. Yay! Okay, so that's a simple review of markets. When we talk about elasticities, you can think about this market being a generally, like the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply being generally the same. If we think about a good with really high price elasticities, we're going to see higher deadweight loss. High elasticity means more elastic, more responsive, which means when that tax comes in, more people are going to leave the market to avoid the tax, and that's going to increase the deadweight loss. So if we put a tax on something that maybe is a luxury good, like a donut tax, it's very easy to avoid eating donuts. Even if you want something sweet, there's another pastry you could eat. So if the government puts a $2 tax on donuts, we might see the quantity decrease by a lot more, and that would give us a much bigger deadweight loss, a much bigger economic impact, and reduce the revenue associated with that tax. What about if we tax something with low deadweight loss? So think about taxing medicine. Medicine is something that we expect to have really low price elasticity of demand because it's a necessity without a lot of substitutes. So if you need a prescription that has some intellectual property controls on it, so there's no, what's the word? There's no alternative, there's no generic, then you're going to pretty much buy that medicine no matter what. So that means you're going to be not responsive to a change in price, which is going to give you a steep demand curve. And that's because even if the price goes up by a lot, you're still going to buy about the same amount because that's the medicine you need. If the price goes down by a lot, you're not going to buy a lot more. It's medicine. You're not going to double your doses. That's not healthy. So how much you consume isn't affected, isn't elastic relative to the price. The changes in price don't have a big effect on change in quantity demand. And remember, that's how we, mathematically express price elasticity of demand. It's the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. So that's all we're looking at is how much does this change this? So now we can assume the medicine has really really low price elasticity of demand. Consumers are not responsive. On the other hand, let's say this medicine is easy to store and easy to produce, and so the price elasticity of supply is going to be really high. Firms can stop selling it and wait until prices get better. They can ramp up supply and make more if prices are high, store it and wait till the situation improves if prices get low. So that's going to be a flat supply curve where a small change in price going from maybe here to here is going to have a big effect on quantity demanded. And if you don't believe me, I'll show you. So let's find our equilibrium first, where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. I'm going to just give us an equilibrium value and price. And now you can kind of see how if we lower the price to say, or rather let's raise the price because of a tax, the effect on quantity demanded, it's a little wobbly, is pretty small, whereas the effect on quantity supplied would be really large, right? If the equilibrium was 100 and we raise the price, producers will produce a lot more. Consumers aren't going to consume a lot less. The decrease in quantity demanded is small relative to the increase in quantity supplied. So that's part of how we know that this is a low price elasticity of demand, high price elasticity of supply good. Also, we can see it from the shape of the curves. So now let's go ahead and put those, show how that would affect taxation, deadweight loss, and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and impose a tax on this medicine. We're going to tax it $10, and that's going to reduce the price to producers and raise the price to consumers. And already you can see, right, the change in price from equilibrium for producers is a lot less than the change in the equilibrium price for consumers, right? This space is smaller than this space. Consumers bear the incidence of the tax. They pay the majority of the tax. So let's say their cost goes up to $58, and then producers see their cost go, the amount of money they get go down to $48, right? So producers in this case are losing $2 of revenue, and consumers are paying $8 more in price. Ooh, don't lose my whiteboard. We can see a couple of different things here. We can see that that's going to mean that we generate a lot of revenue because quantity, the equilibrium quantity hasn't changed by a lot. We can also see that the deadweight loss is relatively small, right? It's this slivery piece because the demand curve keeps it relatively small. And that's what we're going to see. When there's a very low price elasticity, when someone can't leave the market to avoid the tax, it's going to mean the deadweight loss is less. And so that's why there's an incentive to tax things that are necessities, even though there can be moral reasons not to. So we've got a market here with a tax that is on a good that has inelastic demand and elastic price elasticity of supply. And we see that the majority of the tax is paid by consumers. A small amount is paid by producers. The deadweight loss is small. The reduction in quantity consumed is small. Maybe it goes down to 95. And so that means it's going to be a good revenue generating, low disruption to the market, low deadweight loss, low loss of efficiency tax. So that's one of the many applications that we can use the market forces of supply and demand model to look at. The next video I'll do will look at firms and how we derive those firm cost curves. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.